set up trail cameras in the North Woods of Michigan for 15 years before I captured footage I couldn't explain. The camera was positioned on a game trail near an abandoned mining camp, motion-activated, infrared-capable, and recording in high definition. When I retrieved the SD card in October of 2018, I found 17 seconds of video that changed everything I thought I understood about what lives in those forests. A dogman stood in front of the lens and vocalized patterns that sounded disturbingly like human speech. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. The existence of Dogman in North America has been reported for over 2 centuries, but mainstream science dismisses these accounts as misidentification or folklore. Witnesses describe bipedal canines with human-like intelligence and behaviors that suggest organized social structures. Most sightings occur in heavily forested regions where human presence is minimal and wildlife populations are dense. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan has one of the highest concentrations of reported encounters, particularly in areas surrounding abandoned mining operations from the 19th century. I worked for the State Wildlife Division, documenting predator populations and migration patterns in the Upper Peninsula. My job involved deploying dozens of cameras across thousands of acres, checking them monthly, cataloging the footage, and compiling reports for the department. Most of what I captured was routine: deer, coyotes, the occasional bear, sometimes wolves passing through. The work required long hours alone in remote areas where cell service disappeared and the nearest road could be miles away through dense timber. My educational background included degrees in wildlife biology and ecology, plus specialized training in remote sensing and camera trap methodology. I had published papers on predator-prey dynamics and territorial behavior in large mammals. The department trusted my work because I approached it with scientific rigor and maintained detailed documentation that could withstand peer review. This background made what I eventually captured that much more significant and that much harder to dismiss as amateur misidentification or attention-seeking hoax work. The Upper Peninsula's ecosystem supports healthy populations of wolves, bears, and numerous prey species. The forest is a mixture of hardwoods and conifers with extensive wetlands and stream systems that create ideal habitat for diverse wildlife. Human population density is among the lowest in the eastern United States. Vast tracts of land remain relatively untouched, managed as state or national forest with limited access roads and minimal development pressure. This isolation creates conditions where undocumented species might persist undetected for generations. That particular camera was placed near an old copper mining site from the 1800s. The area had a reputation among locals. Hunters avoided it despite the abundant game. The few who mentioned it used careful language about feeling watched and hearing sounds that didn't match any known animal. I dismissed these accounts as typical wilderness anxiety amplified by isolation and darkness. People hear branches crack and imagine monsters. That's human nature. I had no reason to believe anything genuinely anomalous existed in those woods. The camera had been in place for 6 weeks when I hiked in to check it. The trail was overgrown and showed little recent use beyond scattered deer tracks. The mining camp consisted of collapsed structures and rusted equipment slowly being reclaimed by forest. I had chosen the location specifically because it sat on a natural corridor between 2 ridges where animals moved regularly. The camera itself was secured to a pine tree about 6 feet up, angled downward to capture the full trail width. I noticed something wrong immediately. The tree trunk showed deep scratches I hadn't seen before. 4 parallel gouges ran vertically from above the camera down past it, each groove at least a half-inch deep into the bark. The marks were fresh. Wood inside the cuts showed white and clean without the oxidation that develops over time. Whatever made them had done so recently. The spacing suggested something large with claws significantly bigger than a bear's. I photographed the scratches and documented them in my field notes. When I removed the SD card and checked the camera's battery, I found it nearly drained, despite being fresh 6 weeks prior. The camera should have lasted 4 months minimum. The memory card showed over 300 triggered recordings, far more than typical for that location. Most cameras in similar spots captured 20 to 30 clips per month. This one had been activating constantly. Either the motion sensor was malfunctioning, or something had been spending considerable time directly in front of the lens. I hiked back to my truck and drove to the ranger station where I kept my laptop and equipment. The footage review was part of my routine process. I would sort through clips, tag species, note unusual behavior, and archive everything to the department database. That evening I began working through the files from that camera. The first 200 clips were standard. Deer moving through at dawn and dusk, a fox investigating scent marks, crows landing on the trail. Nothing unusual until I reached file number 214. The clip was 17 seconds long, recorded at 2:37 in the morning. A dogman entered the frame from the left, walking upright on two legs with a gait that looked disturbingly human despite the obvious differences in anatomy. The creature stood approximately 7 feet tall, with a body structure that combined canine and human characteristics in ways that violated basic biology. The head was unmistakably wolf-like, with an elongated snout and pointed ears, but the eyes faced forward with a positioning that suggested predatory intelligence rather than prey awareness. I paused the footage repeatedly to examine every frame. The dogman's fur was dark brown or black, difficult to determine precisely in infrared, with a density that suggested adaptation to cold climates. The musculature was clearly visible through the coat during movement. Each stride showed muscle groups contracting and releasing in patterns that matched bipedal locomotion. The knees bent forward like a human's rather than backward like a dog's hind legs. This anatomical detail alone contradicted any simple explanation of a bear standing momentarily or a person in costume. The dogman's torso showed muscle definition beneath dark fur, the chest broad and the shoulders massive. The arms were longer than human proportions but ended in hands that clearly had opposable thumbs. The creature moved with purpose rather than the random wandering typical of animals. It approached the camera directly, stopped 3 feet from the lens, and looked up at it. The eyes reflected the infrared illumination with a bright green glow that made them appear luminous and alien. What happened next made me replay the clip 12 times before I accepted what I was seeing. The dogman's mouth opened and it vocalized a series of sounds that had structure and pattern. The audio wasn't barking or howling. It was articulated speech or something very close to it. The sounds had rhythm and varied pitch with clear breaks between what could have been words. I couldn't understand the meaning, but the intentionality was obvious. This wasn't random animal noise. It was communication directed at the camera. I isolated the audio and ran it through analysis software designed to identify species vocalizations. The program rejected it as unknown. The frequency range was too low for a wolf but higher than most bear sounds. The articulation showed complexity beyond any documented canine communication. I slowed the playback and listened repeatedly. Certain sounds repeated in patterns that suggested linguistic structure. Others were clearly distinct phonemes that rose and fell with what sounded like emotional inflection. The vocalization lasted approximately 4 seconds within the 17-second clip. The dogman produced 7 distinct sound units separated by brief pauses. Each unit had internal structure with consonant and vowel-like elements. The phonetic complexity suggested vocal tract anatomy capable of articulate speech production. Wolves can produce various howls, barks, and whines, but they lack the physical apparatus for the range of sounds captured in this recording. What I was hearing required control over airflow, tongue positioning, and oral cavity shape that no known canid possesses. I contacted a colleague who specialized in bioacoustics and animal communication. I sent him the audio file without context or explanation of its source. His analysis confirmed the unusual nature of the recording. The spectrogram showed harmonic patterns inconsistent with known North American mammals. The frequency modulation suggested intentional control rather than reflexive vocalization. When I asked if it could be speech, he said it showed characteristics of linguistic communication, including segmentation, hierarchical structure, and prosodic variation. He wanted to know what species produced it. I couldn't tell him. Not yet. I needed more evidence before exposing myself to professional ridicule. The scientific community has strict standards for extraordinary claims. A single ambiguous recording would be dismissed immediately regardless of my credentials. I needed multiple independent documentation instances, preferably from different researchers in different locations. I needed physical evidence beyond video and audio. Hair samples, scat, skeletal remains, anything that could be subjected to DNA analysis and morphological study. Without that, I had nothing that would withstand peer review. After the vocalization, the Dogman reached up and touched the camera with one hand. The footage shook as the creature adjusted the angle slightly, pointing it more directly at the ground. Then it stepped back, looked at the lens one more time, and walked away. The movement out of frame was deliberate and controlled. It knew what the camera was. It understood it was being recorded, and it had left what I could only interpret as a message or warning. I sat in the ranger station until dawn, trying to process what I had seen. Every rational explanation failed. This wasn't a person in a costume. The anatomy was too consistent, and the movements too natural. No suit could replicate the way muscles shifted beneath the fur or how the joints articulated. The size alone made it implausible. This wasn't a known animal either. No bear or wolf walked upright with that posture or showed the hand dexterity captured in the footage. I copied the file to 3 separate drives and uploaded it to secure cloud storage. Then I filed my monthly report to the department and deliberately omitted any mention of the anomalous footage. I knew how it would be received. At best, I would be accused of falling for a hoax. At worst, they would question my competence and remove me from fieldwork. I needed to gather more evidence before presenting anything. A single clip would never be enough. 2 days later, I returned to the site with fresh batteries and a full memory card. The camera was exactly where I had left it after repositioning it to its original angle. The scratches on the tree looked deeper somehow, though that might have been psychological. I examined the area around the camera for tracks or scat. The ground was too hard and covered with pine needles to show clear prints, but I found places where vegetation had been disturbed by something moving through recently. I also deployed 2 additional cameras nearby, creating a small network that would capture different angles of the trail. If the Dogman returned, I wanted comprehensive documentation. I used professional equipment designed for wildlife research, not commercial trail cameras. The image quality was substantially higher and the motion detection more sensitive. I set them to record video rather than still images and configured them for maximum battery life. The next 3 weeks were the longest of my career. I forced myself to maintain my regular schedule, checking other cameras across my assigned territory. Every site had routine footage except the ones near the mining camp. Those cameras triggered frequently but showed nothing on the recordings. Empty trail. Wind-moving branches, shadows shifting as clouds passed overhead. Something was activating the sensors without appearing on camera, which should have been impossible given how they worked. During this period, I researched everything I could find about Dogman sightings in the Upper Peninsula. The reports went back over a century with remarkable consistency in descriptions. Upright canines between 6 and 8 feet tall, intelligent behavior, vocalizations that sometimes included speech-like sounds. Most accounts came from hunters or hikers who glimpsed something briefly before it vanished into heavy cover. A few described encounters where the Dogman displayed clear awareness of being observed and deliberately positioned itself to be seen. One pattern emerged across multiple accounts. Witnesses often reported finding their equipment moved or manipulated, trail markers relocated, gear rearranged, cameras repositioned. The behavior suggested curiosity about human technology and intelligence sufficient to understand at a basic level what these objects were for. This matched what I had captured on video. The Dogman had recognized the camera and interacted with it purposefully. When I checked the cameras again in early November, all 3 had been destroyed, not knocked down or damaged by weather, but deliberately dismantled. The camera housings were torn open and the internal components scattered across the trail. Memory cards were missing entirely. The trees where they had been mounted showed fresh claw marks. Whoever or whatever had done this knew exactly what they were looking for and had systematically eliminated my surveillance capability. The destruction pattern was methodical. Each camera had been removed from its mounting bracket by force that bent the metal hardware. The housings were opened by prying at the seams rather than breaking the entire unit randomly. Internal circuit boards were pulled out and thrown aside while the memory cards were removed and taken. This required understanding which components contained the recorded data. A random animal destroying equipment would have simply smashed everything. This was selective dismantlement. I examined the scattered components closely. The circuit boards showed tooth marks, but the pattern was wrong for any animal I knew. The spacing and depth suggested canine dentition, but scaled up significantly. Bears have large teeth, but their bite pressure typically crushes objects rather than leaving clean punctures. These marks looked like something had carefully gripped the components without destroying them completely, as if testing their structural integrity, or perhaps simply examining them with the only tools available. The claw marks on the trees extended from approximately 8 feet high down to ground level. 4 parallel gouges in each set, each groove deep enough to expose fresh wood beneath the bark. The consistency of the spacing across multiple trees suggested the same individual or individuals with identical physical characteristics made all the marks. I photographed everything thoroughly and collected bark samples from the scarred areas. Microscopic examination might reveal biological material embedded in the grooves. I stood on that trail looking at the wreckage and felt genuine fear for the first time. This wasn't random destruction by a curious bear. It was targeted removal of specific technology by something that understood what cameras did. The message was clear. The Dogman knew I was documenting it and wanted that documentation stopped. The question was whether it would be satisfied with destroying the equipment or if it considered me a threat that needed to be addressed more directly. I should have left right then. I should have abandoned the site and never returned. But I had spent my entire career pursuing scientific understanding of wildlife, and this represented a discovery that would redefine everything we thought we knew about North American fauna. I convinced myself that one more attempt was justified. I would use better concealment, place cameras at greater distances, and maintain observation protocols that minimize my presence. It was terrible reasoning driven by ambition and curiosity that overrode basic survival instinct. I returned a week later with military-grade surveillance equipment borrowed from a contact in law enforcement. Cameras designed for covert operations with wireless transmission capability and motion sensors tuned to detect large mammal movement. I positioned them in trees 50 yards from the trail, concealed in bark-textured housings that blended invisibly with the surrounding trunks. I configured them to upload footage directly to a secure server so the memory cards couldn't be destroyed or stolen. The first upload came that same night. At 2300 hours, one camera transmitted a 10-second clip showing a dogman walking along the trail edge, staying in cover beneath the canopy. The creature moved with clear understanding of camera placement, keeping to angles where the equipment wouldn't capture detailed views. It paused once, turned its head toward the camera position, and stared directly at the concealed lens. Then it continued moving and disappeared from frame. The footage confirmed these creatures knew they were being monitored and took active measures to avoid documentation. Over the next 4 days, I received sporadic uploads showing similar brief clips. The dogman, or possibly multiple dogmen, moving through the area in ways that suggested territorial patrolling. The gait and posture varied between individuals, indicating at least 3 separate animals. They traveled primarily at night between dusk and dawn. During daylight hours, the cameras captured nothing. The creatures were nocturnal by preference or possibly by necessity if they wanted to avoid human encounters. The uploaded footage revealed behavioral patterns consistent with intelligent planning. The dogmen moved along established routes that provided maximum cover while offering good sightlines to potential approach paths. They paused frequently to scan their surroundings with obvious awareness of their environment. Several clips showed them stopping to investigate specific locations, lowering their heads to sniff the ground or examining trees with their hands. The behavior resembled primate investigation more than typical canine searching. One clip captured 2 dogmen together. They were approximately the same size, moving in parallel about 20 yards apart. They maintained visual contact with each other, occasionally turning their heads to check the other's position. The coordination suggested either pack behavior or possibly something more complex like cooperative territory monitoring. Midway through the clip, one dogman made a brief vocalization. The other paused, turned toward the sound, and appeared to respond with a different vocalization. Then both continued moving. This interaction was significant because it demonstrated active communication in real time. The vocalizations were shorter than the speech-like patterns from the original footage, possibly simple contact calls or status updates between individuals. But the immediate response and subsequent behavioral adjustment suggested the sounds carried specific meaning that was understood and acted upon. This wasn't just noise. It was information exchange, serving practical coordination purposes. On the fifth night, the upload stopped. All three cameras went offline simultaneously at 2:14 in the morning. I drove to the site immediately, arriving at dawn with a flashlight and bear spray. The cameras were gone. Not destroyed this time, but completely removed, including the mounting hardware. The trees showed claw marks identical to the previous damage. I found one camera smashed on the ground 200 yards into the forest, carried there and broken against rocks. The others had vanished entirely. As I stood there examining the damage, I heard something moving in the brush, approximately 50 yards upslope. Branches snapped under substantial weight. Whatever was moving didn't attempt stealth. I turned toward the sound and caught a glimpse of dark fur between the trees. The dogman stood partially visible behind a thick pine trunk, watching me. We maintained eye contact for perhaps 5 seconds. Then it stepped back into heavier cover and disappeared. Those 5 seconds felt eternal. The dogman's eyes reflected the morning light with an amber glow that seemed to pierce directly into me. Not with hostility exactly, but with assessment. It was studying me the same way I had been studying it through camera footage for weeks. The expression on its face, if that word even applied to such features, showed neither fear nor aggression. It displayed calm evaluation of a situation it controlled completely. I was in its territory. I was the one being observed and catalogued. The physical presence of the creature was overwhelming in a way video couldn't capture. The sheer size and mass of it, standing partially concealed behind a tree trunk that would have hidden a human completely. The way it held itself perfectly still except for the slight movement of its head tracking my position. The shoulders were massive, suggesting strength far beyond anything a human could match. If it chose to attack, I would have no defense. The bear spray on my belt was a ridiculous token against something that intelligent and powerful. I realized in that moment that I had been monumentally foolish. I had approached this as a scientific problem requiring documentation and analysis. I had thought in terms of camera placement and evidence collection, but I had failed to properly assess the risk of investigating something that clearly didn't want to be investigated. The dogman had destroyed multiple sets of surveillance equipment. It had made its position clear through actions, and I had interpreted that as a challenge rather than a warning. The encounter lasted only moments, but the impression it left was profound. The eyes showed intelligence that went beyond animal awareness. It was evaluating me, making decisions about threat levels and appropriate responses. I had the distinct sense I was being warned. The camera destruction wasn't random vandalism, it was communication. The dogman was making clear that continued surveillance would not be tolerated, and that I was being monitored as closely as I was monitoring it. I backed away slowly toward my truck without turning around. Every survival instinct I had was screaming to run, but I knew that would trigger pursuit. Predators chase. I kept my eyes on the tree line and moved with deliberate calm. The walk back to the vehicle took 15 minutes that felt like hours. I heard movement paralleling my path through the woods, something large keeping pace with me hidden in the undergrowth. It didn't approach closer but made no attempt to hide its presence. When I reached my truck, I climbed in, locked the doors, and sat with the engine running for several minutes. My hands were shaking. The dogman emerged from the trees at the far end of the clearing and stood watching the truck from 100 yards away. It made no aggressive moves, simply stood there upright with its arms at its sides. The posture was almost human and deeply unsettling because of it. After a long moment, it turned and walked back into the forest. I filed my resignation with the Wildlife Division 2 weeks later. I claimed health issues and requested immediate reassignment to desk duties. My supervisor accepted without question, though I saw concern in his expression. I had always been enthusiastic about fieldwork, and the sudden change was obviously suspicious. He asked if something had happened. I said only that I had decided remote assignments were no longer suitable for me. He didn't push further. Before I left field service completely, I went back one final time. I needed closure or confirmation, or perhaps just to prove to myself that what I had experienced was real. I drove to the mining camp in daylight during mid-afternoon. The area looked different in full sun, less ominous but still deeply isolated. I parked and walked the trail where the cameras had been. The scratch marks on the trees had faded but remained visible. The disturbed areas where equipment had been torn down showed clearly. I found something I hadn't noticed before: a pile of stones arranged in a deliberate pattern near the largest scratch tree. They formed a rough circle about 3 feet across, with a cairn-like structure in the center. The arrangement was clearly intentional and recent enough that vegetation hadn't started growing through it. Similar stone formations had been reported in other Dogman encounter areas across the Upper Peninsula. No one understood their purpose, but they appeared consistently enough to suggest communication or territorial marking. The stones themselves were unremarkable, common granite and basalt found throughout the region, but their arrangement required deliberate effort and spatial planning. The outer circle consisted of approximately 20 stones placed at regular intervals. The central cairn was built from progressively smaller stones stacked to about 18 inches high. The structure was stable and carefully balanced. Wind or random animal activity could not have created this pattern. It required hands and intention. I documented the formation with photographs from multiple angles and took measurements of the dimensions and spacing. Then I carefully dismantled it to examine the ground beneath. The stones had been placed on relatively level ground with no excavation or site preparation. No organic materials or objects were buried underneath. If this was a ritual site or marker of some kind, its significance was entirely in the arrangement rather than associated with any hidden elements. After documenting everything, I faced a decision. Should I leave the formation as I found it, or dismantle it completely? Leaving it intact might encourage the Dogman to create more, potentially providing additional behavioral data. But it also signaled that I had returned to the area and might be continuing surveillance. Dismantling it completely would eliminate the marker, but might be interpreted as a hostile act, destroying something they had deliberately constructed. I compromised by partially reassembling it in a simplified form, hoping this would be read as acknowledgement without provocation. As I examined the stones, I heard the vocalization again. It came from deep in the forest, that same structured sound pattern I had heard on the camera footage. The Dogman was communicating across distance. The sounds rose and fell with clear intentionality. I couldn't determine if it was calling to others of its kind or directing the message at me. The vocalization lasted approximately 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly. Silence returned to the forest. I left quickly and didn't look back. On the drive out, I thought about the implications of what I had documented. These creatures existed. They were intelligent. They understood human technology at some level and actively avoided being recorded. They maintained territorial control over specific areas and communicated that control to intruders. The question of what they were and where they came from remained completely unanswered. No known species matched the morphology or behavior I had witnessed. I debated for months whether to release the footage I had captured. The 17-second clip of the Dogman vocalizing remained the only clear documentation I possessed. Everything else had been destroyed or confiscated when the cameras were taken. I contacted several cryptozoology researchers and shared the file under conditions of anonymity. Their analysis confirmed what I already knew. The footage was genuine as far as they could determine, with no evidence of digital manipulation or costume work. The cryptozoology community received the footage with enthusiasm mixed with frustration. Here was potentially the clearest documentation of Dogman vocalization ever captured, but without chain of custody documentation or verifiable source information, its value as scientific evidence was severely compromised. They wanted to know the exact location, the camera specifications, the circumstances of deployment, and my credentials as the researcher who collected it. I couldn't provide most of that without exposing myself to professional consequences I wasn't prepared to face. Several researchers pointed out details in the footage that supported authenticity. The way light reflected off the dogman's eyes was consistent with tapetum lucidum, the reflective layer present in nocturnal predators but absent in primates, including humans. The musculature visible beneath the fur showed anatomically correct movement patterns that would be extremely difficult to replicate with prosthetics or costumes. The proportions of the limbs matched descriptions from multiple independent witness accounts across different time periods and geographic regions. Most mainstream scientists refused to examine the material. The few who agreed to view it dismissed it as elaborate hoax work, or suggested rare medical conditions that might produce the apparent morphology. No one was willing to consider the possibility that an undocumented large predator existed in North American forests. The academic and professional consequences of endorsing such a claim were too severe. Even researchers who privately believed the footage was genuine wouldn't say so publicly. 6 months after my last visit to the mining camp, I received a phone call from a federal agent who identified himself as part of a wildlife task force. He asked specific questions about my time working in the Upper Peninsula. Had I encountered anything unusual? Had I documented any species that didn't match known fauna? Had I filed reports about anomalous findings? I answered honestly. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he thanked me and said someone would be in touch if they needed additional information. No one ever called back. The agent's questions were too specific to be routine follow-up. He knew exactly what to ask and how to phrase inquiries that would elicit relevant information without directly mentioning Dogman or other cryptid species. The questions about anomalous findings focused on behavior rather than appearance. Did I observe communication between animals that seemed more complex than typical? Did I find evidence of tool use or environmental manipulation? Had I noticed territorial marking systems that didn't match known species? These were not standard wildlife survey questions. A colleague later told me that same agent had visited several other wildlife researchers in the region, asking similar questions. All of them had spent time working near the mining camp area. All of them had encountered things they couldn't explain. The agent collected their reports, and the encounters were never officially documented. The federal government was aware of the dogman population and was actively suppressing information about it. What they knew and how long they had known it remained classified. This suppression made sense from a bureaucratic standpoint. Confirming the existence of a large, intelligent predator in North American forests would create massive public safety concerns and liability issues. National forests and state parks would face pressure to restrict access or provide warnings. Property values in affected regions would decline. Hunting regulations would need revision. The entire outdoor recreation industry would be impacted. Better to maintain official denial and manage the situation quietly than acknowledge something that would create widespread panic and economic disruption. I wondered how many researchers had been contacted over the years. How many had captured similar footage or encountered dogmen during fieldwork? The pattern of systematic suppression suggested this had been happening for decades at minimum, possibly longer. The government might have documented these creatures since the early days of national forest establishment in the early 20th century. Rangers and wildlife officers might have standing protocols for handling dogman encounters that were never shared publicly. A colleague later told me that same agent had visited several other wildlife researchers in the region asking similar questions. All of them had spent time working near the mining camp area. All of them had encountered things they couldn't explain. The agent collected their reports, and the encounters were never officially documented. The federal government was aware of the dogman population and was actively suppressing information about it. What they knew and how long they had known it remained classified. I think about that footage constantly. The dogman standing in front of the camera, vocalizing in patterns that suggested language, reaching up to adjust the angle with clear understanding of its function. The intelligence in those eyes, the deliberate destruction of surveillance equipment, the territorial marking with stone formations. These weren't simple animals operating on instinct. They were something else entirely, something that had learned to live alongside human civilization while remaining almost completely hidden from it. The vocalization itself haunts me most. I have listened to the audio thousands of times trying to decode meaning. Certain sounds repeat in context that suggest specific concepts. Others appear to be emotional expressions. The structure implies grammar and syntax even if I cannot identify individual words. Whatever language the Dogman uses, it is sophisticated enough to communicate complex ideas. The fact that they directed it at a camera suggests they were leaving a message for whoever reviewed the footage. I created detailed spectrograms of each sound unit and compared them across multiple listening sessions. The first unit appeared to be a low-frequency vocalization with rising intonation at the end, possibly functioning as an interrogative or attention-getting device. The second and third units were shorter and sharper, perhaps declarative statements. The fourth unit had the most complex internal structure with multiple frequency modulations, suggesting it carried the most semantic content. The final three units decreased in volume and frequency, possibly functioning as a closing or departure signal. If I allowed myself to interpret the vocalization as actual communication rather than sophisticated animal sounds, a rough translation might be something like, "Attention, you are observing. We know this. Your equipment is noted. You should leave." That interpretation was purely speculative, based on behavioral context rather than linguistic analysis, but it matched what subsequently happened. The Dogman had addressed the camera, demonstrated awareness of surveillance, and then systematically destroyed all monitoring equipment in the area. The message fit the subsequent actions perfectly. Alternative interpretations existed. Perhaps the vocalization was simply a territorial marker, the Dogman equivalent of scent marking or boundary establishment. Many animals produce distinctive calls that announce their presence and claim of an area, but territorial calls are typically loud and projected over distance to warn away rivals or attract mates. This vocalization was directed specifically at the camera from close range with moderate volume. That suggested it was meant for the intended viewer rather than broadcast generally. The most unsettling possibility was that the Dogman understood not just that the camera was recording, but that humans would review that recording later. This implied theory of mind, the ability to model the mental states of others and predict their future actions. Theory of mind is considered a hallmark of advanced cognition, present in humans, great apes, and possibly dolphins and corvids. If the Dogman possessed this capability, they were operating at a cognitive level far beyond what we associate with non-human animals. I wonder if the message was a warning or something else. Perhaps it was an attempt at communication. Maybe the Dogman recognized that humans used these devices to study animals and wanted to be acknowledged as more than wildlife. The speech patterns could have been saying, "We are aware of you. We understand what you are doing here. We are intelligent enough to engage with you on terms beyond predator and prey." That would explain why it looked directly at the camera and vocalized so deliberately. The alternative interpretation is darker. The vocalization could have been territorial assertion, a declaration that this area belonged to the Dogman and that human presence would not be tolerated. The subsequent destruction of equipment and the parallel tracking when I walked back to my truck support that theory. They were making clear that they controlled that territory absolutely and that continued intrusion would have consequences. Either way, the message was unmistakable. We were not welcome. Sometimes I consider going back. I keep the coordinates marked in my GPS and the access route memorized. The scientific value of additional documentation would be immeasurable. Video of Dogman vocalizations with associated behavioral context could revolutionize cryptozoology and force mainstream science to acknowledge these creatures exist. But I remember standing in that clearing with the Dogman watching me from the trees. I remember the intelligence in those eyes and the very clear sense that I was being evaluated as a potential threat. The risk-benefit analysis doesn't favor return. Even if I captured additional footage, the pattern established by my earlier attempts suggests any new documentation would be immediately destroyed. The Dogmen have demonstrated consistent opposition to surveillance and clear willingness to eliminate monitoring equipment, regardless of its sophistication. They adapted their behavior after each deployment, becoming more efficient at locating and destroying cameras. Further attempts would likely yield diminishing returns while increasing personal danger. I also recognize that my presence in their territory creates stress for them as much as their presence disturbs me. They have established this area as their home range, possibly for generations. They have developed strategies for remaining hidden from human observation, despite increasing encroachment from recreational users and resource extraction operations. My persistent surveillance efforts represented a direct challenge to that concealment strategy. From their perspective, I was the invasive threat that needed to be discouraged or eliminated. I chose to respect their boundaries. Whatever the Dogmen are, they have maintained their secrecy for centuries through intelligence and deliberate avoidance of human contact. They destroy evidence of their existence systematically. They understand human technology and how to counter it. They communicate among themselves in ways we are only beginning to recognize, and they have made clear through actions that they want to remain undocumented and undisturbed in the remote places they inhabit. The mining camp remains abandoned. The trails grow over slowly. The forest reclaims the structures and equipment left behind from the 1800s. And somewhere in those woods, the Dogman continue their existence largely unnoticed, except by the occasional hunter or hiker who glimpses something that shouldn't exist and learns very quickly not to talk about it openly. The authorities know, researchers know, but the general public remains unaware because the evidence gets suppressed or dismissed before it can gain traction. I still have the footage. It sits in encrypted storage on multiple drives scattered across secure locations. I watch it occasionally when I need to remind myself that what I experienced was real and not some fever dream born of isolation and too many nights alone in the wilderness. The Dogman is there in perfect digital clarity, 7 feet tall, walking upright, looking directly at the camera, opening its mouth and vocalizing sounds that approximate speech, and then reaching up with obvious understanding to adjust the angle before walking away. What I recorded in those 17 seconds represents either one of the most significant zoological discoveries of the modern era or the most elaborate and inexplicable hoax ever perpetrated. But I know which explanation is true. I was there. I saw the scratch marks and the stone formations. I heard the vocalizations across distance. I looked into those eyes and recognized intelligence looking back. The Dogman are real. They are here. And they have made very clear that they intend to remain hidden from us, regardless of our attempts to document their existence. To anyone reading this who plans to search for them, understand what you are attempting. These creatures are not animals in the way we typically use that term. They are intelligent enough to recognize surveillance equipment, sophisticated enough to systematically destroy it, and territorial enough to make clear when you have crossed boundaries they consider inviolable. They will avoid you if possible. But if you push too far, if you refuse to acknowledge their warnings, they will push back, and you will not win that confrontation. The last time I drove past the turnoff to the mining camp, I felt that familiar pull to go back, to see if I could capture more footage, to try one more time to document what I know exists in those woods. I kept driving. Some discoveries are not meant to be made public. Some creatures earn the right to their secrecy through sheer persistence and intelligence. The Dogman have existed alongside human civilization for centuries without being definitively proven. They have earned their privacy through careful behavior and systematic elimination of evidence. I think about that vocalization every day. The sounds echo in my memory with perfect clarity. Sometimes late at night I convince myself I can almost understand what was being said. The tone, the rhythm, the structure. It was communication meant to be understood even if I lack the context to properly interpret it. Perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the Dogman was saying something simple and direct. This is our territory. We are aware of you. We choose not to harm you, but you must leave and not return. That is exactly what I did. I left and I have not returned. The footage remains secured and backed up in multiple locations. If something happens to me, instructions exist for its release to specific researchers who might handle it appropriately. Until then, it stays hidden, just as the Dogmen prefer to stay hidden. They made their wishes clear, through actions, and through that brief, vocalized message captured on a trail camera in the woods of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I was fortunate enough to receive that message and wise enough to listen. For more interesting stories like this, consider subscribing.